The golden rule in all these sorts of efforts is that researchers need to get a lot more out of it than they put into it in order to do it. By adding a report, it's a small step where you can see other people using your research, other researchers pulling it into their insights over the long term. So, a one stop shop for a single insight with a great title, its own URL, and supporting evidence. And you can get really fancy from there and create an insight summary hub and all those sorts of things. But to start with, it's just saying, what are the top insights that aren't moving the needle?
Hey, it's Ben. Welcome to Awkward Silences. This week, we have a conversation with Jake Burghardt, who is out with a new book called Stop Wasting Research, Maximize the Product Impact of Your Organization's Customer Insights. The conversation spans a whole host of topics, all again focused on this idea of wasting research and how we can stop it. It's a really good conversation for anyone who has felt a bit isolated in their organization. Jake talks about ways of breaking down silos. He also has a really wonderful framework for creating breadcrumbs from your report or what he thinks you ought to be creating, which is sort of an insights summary statement, how you can loop in your partners and stakeholders in the creation of that process, and how using insight statements that link back to reports, that link back to your information, your method, your sample, all the things that, that we as researchers like to learn about, how those practices can really help create an insights library or a research repository. I do, of course, a bunch of meandering talking, but I think you're really going to benefit from Jake's conversation and his thoughts around wasting research, whether you're an IC practitioner trying to make more impact with your work, or you're a leader of a team trying to make inroads up and out with your team. So here is Jake Burghardt on Awkward Silences. Enjoy. Jake Burghardt, welcome to Awkward Silences.
Hey, thank you so much.
I'm very excited to be talking with you, and I'm going to do my very best to let you talk more than I am going to talk. Jake, we have you on because you're out with a new book called Stop Wasting Research. And the subtitle reads, Maximize the Product Impact of Your Organization's Customer Insights. And yeah, there's the title. I love it. I love thinking about maybe a conversation for another day, how the cover art came about, but it's got this wonderful inverted triangle, which is in a solid hue, and it disperses down, to all these wonderful, I don't know if those are insights streams or if those are actionable moments, but we are here to talk about research waste, what it is, where it comes from, who should care about it. And then I want to spend the majority of our time, because many of the folks listening here are themselves researchers or managing researchers, how they can actually stop wasting their research. So if we can, I want to do a little bit of background. Why did you want to write a book about wasting research? Was there a moment you were like, oh my gosh, I have so much to say about this? Was it an accumulation of things throughout your experience? Take us back pre-book.
It was more an accumulation of things. There wasn't one particular moment. I got started in .com as a UX researcher. I've always been a generalist and worked across a variety of roles. As a consultant for many years, I got tired of throwing things over the wall, so I decided I wanted to go in-house and spend some time getting more value out of existing research and, at Amazon as a principal UX researcher and, principal product manager for insights products. So it ended up becoming this specialty, but just to speak more generally, like across my career, I've always had this emphasis on getting more juice out of existing learning about problem finding before problem solving and showing up at client sites and finding all sorts of things that were underutilized in the consulting days, and then in-house at big tech, at Microsoft and Amazon, finding lots of underutilized work, having the opportunity to look through literally hundreds of studies in some instances in different organizations. And across all of it, there was all of this kind of conversation emerging in the industry about research repositories and knowledge management, and using knowledge management frameworks and the amazing things that community's done over a long period of time. But I felt like there's just some missing ingredients in all of it. And the industry kind of pushing tools as a focus, and then folks, the most common questions about research repositories being what tool do you use, and then why is it failing? So there's a huge amount of activation work and change management to these efforts. And I saw a niche, a area. There's so much in the industry about optimizing research process up
Sure.
through the end of the study and reporting out. But the follow through of that in all sorts of forms, whether it's the depths of research repositories or just more activation strategies for accumulated research, I just didn't see anything there. So, in sort of a COVID detour, I put out some Medium articles. I got some great responses to it, and that led me to work with Rosenfeld. And it's a lot of fun to stew on a topic over a period of time and really learn from what's going on in the industry, from research ops and product ops and design ops, all these emerging disciplines, and put together something that I hope people find really useful.
Yeah, and we'll link certainly to the book in the show notes. And I love that you mentioned it. I'm happy you mentioned the tools over sort of technique and tactics. I think too often, as someone who works on the research vendor side, we're constantly combating the marketing around an all-in-one, a tool that can do it all. And I think for time-strapped practitioners, it sounds alluring to say like, oh, well, if I just build a repository, or maybe it's called an insights hub, or maybe it's called a library, which let me say those things are valuable. Those are things that are important to do. I know you've got a crib from Kate Towsey. Shout out to Kate, who is the one who talks about and advances the importance of those things. But I think it can sometimes we lean too much into the tool as the solution. And so I'm really looking forward to, over the course of this conversation, looking at the tactics that make a repository useful. But I do think it's important to mention that, we've been hearing this for a long time, that researchers are sort of crossing their fingers after the deliverable or the report is shared or the workshop concludes, because they are often, as you probably experienced in your time as a practitioner, on to the next, problem or fire or stakeholder need. And that activation, I'm using air quotes for our listeners, that activation is so important. So before we get to that last little bit wherein we talk about how we can make things stickier and have longer tails and all the things, stop wasting the research, couldn't you succinctly describe what is research waste and how we know when research is being wasted?
Thank you for asking. I spent a lot of time on the definitions in the book. So, chapter one kind of digs into some basics. I take a big definition of customer research because you have to start at the top there, a broad umbrella that covers sort of all of the sources that decision makers are receiving today from, market research, data science, UX research, CX, and analysts, and on from there. I've got the common denominator is drawing a box around what we're going to pick up by saying it's using a great research process that folks on this pod listeners would recognize. So it starts with the definition of research, and then from there, research waste is all of those insights, those valuable things that were left behind in research process. So, you don't write a book called Stop Wasting Research unless you care a lot about research and you're excited about the value that it already provides. So, let me start by saying researchers in industry are already doing amazing things that are advancing careers and products. And at the end of their optimized study process, they're getting great wins. But there's a remainder, and that remainder, there's a bunch of reasons why that I call out in the book, but they don't land in next steps. And whatever those next steps might be in your organization and the teams you're trying to influence, the plan, like specifications, backlogs, roadmaps, various types of planning deliverables, where you can see proof that that insight is going to make a difference. And so they're left on sort of this cutting room floor, and that is leaving behind new sources of value for an organization that could apply to what they're thinking of next. It's not old research. Some of it is obviously out of date. We can look at it and say that's no longer relevant, but we don't have to just put an expiration date on this content. We can find things that are years old that are still very relevant for tomorrow's conversation. So it's about that remainder and what can we do to pick it up, because it can be a lot more value from existing research. And the quote, just to close it out, is one of the things, not a quote, but a bit that really resonated with reviewers of the book was, what would competitors pay to know the research learning that you've left behind?
Wow. Yeah.
It speaks to this is valuable business assets, and it can apply to all the things that leaders care about for what's next. It's not just old news.
I think I'm so glad you mentioned that business element, because I've been working with lots of folks in the community, and this is an evergreen topic, but it seems that post COVID and our return to the current normal, there's been lots of budget oscillations and headcount changes and rifts, and now we have AI, which lots of lots of managers, maybe not all, are thinking, how might this affect my team? How is this going to affect my headcount? And so the wider conversation is, okay, researchers, certainly we want to grow in our practice. We want to continue sharpening our skills. And there's this recognition that we are part of a business. And so we need, you hear talk topics like ROI and getting business savvy. And I'm seeing researchers ask whether or not they should, get a management course. And so I think
Mm.
research waste is a really nice framework, a great lens to, if you're not someone who wants to go out and get an MBA because it might not fit with your career trajectory. I think it's a really nice framework. Who doesn't love a framework of thinking about the ROI, the investment of research? Because who you don't want the hard labor of a team, any team, certainly a research team that's expending time to identify a project opportunity, recruit participants, engage with those participants, synthesize learning. If there's waste, and I don't want to be overly efficient, but I like that thinking about what are you missing. I'll end by saying a research leader that I spoke with earlier in the year, I was asking her, she works on a big international team, and she says, at the end of each year, I present to all the leaders of the different team. Here are all the great things we did. Yeah, 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 rah, rah, rah. And she said she always makes sure to say, here's what we didn't get to. Here's what your either my bandwidth constraints or the fact that my headcount changed or our shifting priorities. Here's what you told me we wanted to learn, but we didn't learn. And so I think leaving things on the cutting room floor and having that frame of a loss frame is something that could be convincing to stakeholders. When you are talking to and we're interviewing research leaders, did they find that this frame of waste or lost opportunity was a way to meaning make for their stakeholders who might not be researchers themselves?
Yeah, it has this activating emotion to it, is why I leaned into it. Really what we're talking about is underutilized or unused valuable research. Not all research fits that bucket. We're not talking about 100% utilization, but it does have sort of an activating feel to it that speaks to the fact that it's something that we can pick up, and there are root causes for it that are elucidated in the book and become the structure of the book. There's reasons why research doesn't make the cut, and we can think about it more systemically. I can get into those, but I think that the framing for researchers, it really resonates, and for their stakeholders and decision makers, what resonates most is directly applicable valuable to what they care about, just like in a
Hmm.
research study. So if the standard model of research is so much about driving alignment with stakeholders, really understanding needs, things coming down the pipe and aligning to them, is a common model of research. There are obviously other models, but the one that folks talk about a lot, when you think about existing research, is similar, where you are trying to take present curiosities, present unknowns, uncertainties, assumptions, and align that work. And some early examples and case studies of that where old research becomes valuable again is the fastest way to get stakeholders interested and start to see it as sort of an internal product that they might want to use.
And when we discuss some of my word is remedy, because I imagine it's an ongoing conversation. It's not a toggle. You're not going to just reduce it overnight. But before we get to that, and I love your frame because it implicates both stakeholders, partners, as well as the researcher. So I think at the top, Jake, I love your book because it takes a holistic view of the organization, and that's whether you're working in house, whether you're as a consultant or an agency partnering with multiple kinds of clients, or whether you're a freelancer, someone who's engaging as a solo shop. The techniques that Jake elucidates in the book. I love that term, Jake. Love when we get to use elucidate on the pod. But before we get into those and the great back and forth that you have between practitioner, researcher, and the stakeholder, quickly, because you have a whole great chapter on this, how can we've talked a little bit about what it is. What can people listening do or steps they might take to start identifying waste? They probably have a lingering sense that like, oh, they missed that slide, or that thing I told them to do. I'm not seeing that in the product roadmap. Are there things that you have found that consistently help teams identify research waste, start to get a sense of how big or the scale of the problem or the opportunity to reduce it?
Absolutely. I talk about a couple of different sort of early ways. And I think it becomes apparent through action once you've kind of motivated doing something about it. That's the best way to really understand the value that's of what's being left behind. But in sort of the early taking stock days, there's some organizations, as you mentioned, I do book talks for folks that have bought a stack of books, and they immediately they've recognized the problem. They already bought in, right? But other organizations need a case study or something that shows, because even some researchers really believe that their older stuff isn't as valuable. So an early step for a lot of folks is taking some of those studies that have been the most impactful that everybody talks about. Every organization has a few things that they hold up. Have you seen this one? Or when someone joins, they send that one, and take a few of those, ideally from different disciplines, different silos, teams, even within the same discipline, and really go back with a highlighter and understand what's been influenced product and start to tell a story about it as a case study. That's one way to kind of, especially on the research side, on the insight generating side, to kind of motivate, oh, wait, there's a lot here that could be applicable. And if there's projects in flight that they can apply to, by all means, like get them in there and try and, develop case studies. I think that those are sort of the early moves to kind of get people interested in the idea. And then, chapter two, is you mentioned, there's a whole chapter on kind of taking stock. And it's about getting folks together and, whether it's a shared canvas or whatever method,
Hmm.
and taking stock of where their research lives, the research storage locations. And they can be everything from, a folder in a drive for a particular study, all the way through to communications hubs, and channels end up being places where a lot of stuff is stored, in fast moving environments. And, looking across different streams of research and understanding where it lives and separating out the place where really the outputs are. Because I could have written a different book called Stop Wasting Research Evidence, but this is about stop wasting, maximizing the value of customer insight. So I say, let's pull out the outputs of these different kinds of learning. And then think about, on the other side of the divide, what are the recurring planning decisions, moments, rituals, deliverables that you want to influence, and map the wins that have come through. What are things that we could double down on and, as a community, continue to grow? And then also, what have been the losses? What are the stories of things that didn't make it across? So it's not a formal insight by insight analysis, but it's really about finding more types of reasons and starting to think about, how can we work backwards? What experiments could we run that, if they were successful, we would turn them into operations to get more value out of this? So a lot of different ways to take stock. Those are a couple that are in the book.
I appreciate that example, and longtime listeners, and certainly anyone who's worked in user experience research or is leading a team, that what Jake just described should be an annual thing for you, or maybe a quarterly thing for you, depending on your output. I hear from a lot of practitioners and certainly research leaders that invisibility of how where do their stakeholders go when they have a question. Maybe they're coached and they have that habit of going to a repository and saying, have we done something on this before? You need to know that. Do you have a channel that they go to? Do you know how often they check it? These sorts of pre-search sorts of questions that Jake is outlining are so valuable for you as a team, not just, as we'll get to, for stopping your research waste, but now you know where and when and how to do kickoffs, roughly, or at least you have a better sense. Now how you can get in front of your stakeholders, or that sort of mapping the organization. I've heard so much about that from folks thinking about their effectiveness and their impact, because we're take those research skills. We hear this a lot, like build good stakeholder relationships, and to do so, treat them like your own customers or your users with whom you're doing research. Think of your organization in that way too. You are a node. And so, Jake, I really love that you take this organizational look to stopping research waste. And so let's transition then to, I love the way you've organized the book, because it's not like, here are the 50 solutions. You've got these but you have root causes that you say are propelling waste, but they are also, depending on the cause that most resonates with a team or an organization, you've got solutions baked in. And so your root causes are three. They are preparation, motivation, and integration. So we've got enough time to go through each. Again, people should buy the book. I want folks to, there are practical guides, there are charts and diagrams, as any good researcher or user experience professional would. Let's start with preparation. Quickly, what is preparation? How can a lack of or a reduction of preparation cause research waste? And how can we begin to address preparation issues with our waste?
Preparation is the idea. If we've optimized the study process for a particular study, and as you mentioned, there's sort of this conveyor belt of studies coming out of different researchers and different disciplines and streams over time. What are we doing in preparation? Is there's more we could do to prepare research for use over the long haul of product development. It's acknowledging that that study time frame isn't when a lot of important insights land. They could be landing much later, and that the report format itself is a useful communication, but it's one of many potential communications. I think the explosion in tooling and research has shown how mutable research could be in terms of its presentation while still being valid and useful. So, what's the format that's going to crack the problem of crossing that divide between existing insights and planning in your organization? How can we organize research so that it's pushed, not just findable? What are new forms of reporting that we can create across all this? So, a bunch of ideas in there. And what does it look like when you're seeing this problem? You got researchers in different parts of the organization that have no idea what each other are doing. That we always talk about duplicate projects with research repositories as a problem, but there's a lot of value beyond going after the same question. I didn't even think to go after that question. There's kind of crosstalk where folks are talking to the same stakeholders, and they're kind of picking and choosing among options, because the research hasn't kind of pulled together a point of view. There's all sorts of things we can talk about in preparation, but that's sort of a quick summary of that root
Yeah.
cause.
Yeah. And within the preparation section, you talk about siloing, knowledge consolidation tools, and organization now for later. Could we talk a bit just about silos? How they just alluded to it there within, like, not just silos between researcher and stakeholder, but intra research silos, wherein, if you're on an embedded team, you might be this one researcher who supports a kind of product or a product feature, but you might have four or five other researchers working across different products. What are ways that we as researchers can begin to break down the silos between one another and identify those opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I would even go so far as to say, within a given researcher, there may be silos between projects where they're not adding up their learning. Ways to start breaking it down, there are ways that are sort of like intro and building community, and then there's more formal information structure ways. In terms of building community, it's making sure the channels are there and sharing more broadly across. It's about looking for opportunities for researchers to find new audiences for each other's work and stitching it into their own work. You can get really fancy with this, but the most basic idea is, uh, how can we turn study processes into not just that latest sample and method for those questions, but a download on what's been learned so far. And that's hard without some of the more advanced steps, but it's still doable to bring in more, and that kind of collaboration and getting more value out of other people's research builds goodwill. So they get those wins as well. And from a decision maker side, from the study plan onward to the deliverable, they're getting more understanding. So finding concrete ways, and the book is about, change management is not just painting a vision, it's about really concrete steps that people can take. The framework of these root causes paints a picture of what you might do, and you'll come up with ideas that I would never consider. But then there's a lot of concrete actions that say, if we did this on a recurring basis, we'd start to make progress towards this abstract thing. And there's a couple of ideas within the preparation root cause. Yeah, breaking
I,
down silos.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the increase. It's longstanding, but of UX research or research guilds that happen internally. Folks get together and they do lunch and learns, and they do offsites, especially at organizations wherein the research team is very dispersed throughout different kinds of products. They might you might have some who report into design, some report I know you have Andy War as one of the cribbers of the book. Shout out to Andy. He does a lot of thinking around to whom, what team should research roll up to, and it isn't often its own thing. And so there is this segmentation and dispersion. But I hear so much from researchers who love to get together. And remember, researchers listening, that's what our partner organizations have done and our partner departments have done to earn that credibility and expertise. We are experts in, again, whether you consider yourself a design thinker or you're a human factors scientist, we have a set of skills that give us expertise such that we can influence decisions in the org. That's what we're here to do. And I think sometimes because we're often really focused on our projects. You said there can sometimes be interest siloing. We like to, I mean, I'll speak for myself. I love getting into an interview guide or spending hours on a survey. But what are your colleagues who maybe support a different kind of project doing? And those actions not only help you, as you're alluding to, Jake, get us sharper and build more visibility, but it helps us build that sense for the organization that we are worth consulting with, that we are a practice that is always growing. I mean, I think about my sales and revenue friends. They are always coaching one another and checking in on feedback. That they take so many great parts of research and just sort of design thinking, and they apply them to their own practices. I think that we ought to, and I know this is happening in many orgs, but that idea of a
Absolutely.
UX guild, I think, really is something we need to take on more.
I think it speaks to the fact it doesn't have to be a reorg, right? It can be in its most extreme case, but this is a very pragmatic book. I'm trying to start with where people are at. And, I talk about sort of once you've had some experiments towards value, that are turning into operations, having an umbrella of an initiative over the top. It's a collective voice for research and, even potentially impact tracking at the initiative level all the way down. So that to your point, we're a force, we're a collective stakeholder. So much research work, part of our challenge has been like you say, people love the individualistic aspect of it. I do too, but there's a lot of value that comes from creating a movement together and becoming a collective stakeholder, not just individual voices. Some of the impacts that strategic things that people want to see are just not going to happen in a lot of contexts by kind of continuing to soldier on as disconnected researchers.
Some of your time has been with the research operations community. Shout out to
Yeah.
Holly and Kate in the reops world. They're doing great work. I think it's also quite telling that, and again, I don't want to say that reops is brand new because lots of solo researchers have been doing research operations work. A friend of mine is one of the research operations folks at Rocket Mortgage, and she talks about how if you're a solo researcher, guess what? You're doing research operations. You're managing your incentives, thinking about your informed consent documentation. You're figuring out how, and this is what I want to ask you about, knowledge consolidation is happening or isn't happening. So we could have a whole pod on insights repositories or libraries. But this is something that you, as someone who has an operations mindset, believe in. It can often feel daunting. So is there a way, I guess, what is your take on, and how do you view the crush of attention around knowledge
Mhm.
management, knowledge consolidation, and how does it fit in with reducing or slowing research waste? It's a big question, but is there something that's very top of mind?
Yeah, I can run with that. It's a topic I've spent a lot of time. So I'm super excited about the trend in the industry, and it aligns to this. It's sort of where I started was tooling, and I expanded outward. Um, and you know, if you think about supporting a lot of different, there's no one right answer to this, and a lot of the articles say state your goals. Like, but I tried to start with some goals in the book for because I have this lens of reducing research waste, what's most useful for doing that? And the other piece is because I use a big definition of customer research, we can't include all those different kinds of researchers' workflows in the tool. I think there's the idea of one tool to rule them all, as you sort of mentioned, but it's just not the reality. Researchers have tool stacks, and a network of researchers will have different ones. So I think the baseline where everybody comes together, and the thing that's lower effort, is to start consolidating reports into a report library, any kind of reporting output. It's the basis of ongoing synthesis, and you can conduct meta-analysis, all those things I was talking about turning reports into a download of what's been known. You need some place that's consolidated to go. It fits into this model of AI supported discovery that people are exploring. You can turn all sorts of models against it, whatever is approved and ethical in your organization.
Hmm.
And, it's not a huge ask in terms of like additions to workflow. It's the golden rule in all these sorts of efforts is that researchers need to get a lot more out of it than they put into it in order to do it. It's standard change management. And, you know, by adding a report, it's a small step where you can see other people using your research, other researchers pulling it into their insights over the long term. So that's the base step. I think the object that I propose for collaboration, because we talk about collaboration and breaking down silos, and everybody nods and says that sounds great, and then we have a meeting and we're all happy about it, and then what do we actually do? We need a concrete object, and in the atomic conversation from Daniel Pidcock and Tomer Sharon's, again, points to the plasticity of this. But my focus on reducing research waste points to a particular kind of object, which is an insight summary, which isn't broken down into a ton of different things. I suppose it could be in a tool, but it's a one-stop shop for a single insight with a great title, its own URL, and supporting evidence. And you can get really fancy from there and create an insight summary hub and all those sorts of things. But to start with, it's just saying, what are the top insights that aren't moving the needle? How can we create this sort of new kind of report? And we're going to ask people to cite this in their plans. And by creating the muscle of actually linking to different things in research repositories, you grow the visibility of research, you show how it's useful as an internal product, and other people can start to emulate it. Because otherwise, why would someone think to use existing research if they're not seeing it in the win of their colleague that they really value? So, I can, to your point, we could do a whole podcast on that, but that's like a quick idea. There's a lot more in the book. I put some articles out on Medium as well on those topics. If you want to dig into those, I can
And we'll
share
link
links.
to those. But that's such a nice. It's there's got to be some term for it. You've distilled a really complex thing, which is what you're advocating and advancing that folks do. Our own internal researchers here at User Interviews, we have one of them who supports our whole org, and she has gotten really good. Shout out to Morgan. She has gotten really good about thinking. Okay, for some of my stakeholders, like Ben, he's going to want to dig into the method and the sample. But for some of our stakeholders, maybe on the engineering or our operations, or they really just need that nugget, that atom of, okay, the thing you learned and how I can use it. And I think that's good for several reasons. It helps remind researchers of, just like we were talking about earlier, how is your research being used or not? And then
Mhm.
what is the function of research in your org? Is it to inform a decision? Probably. So help inform that decision. And I love the breadcrumbing. The how can someone backtrack to something like a repository to again coach that, like, oh, I want to learn a little more. Where do I go? Oh, right. I go to the Insights Hub, or I go to the Notion doc or the Confluence space. It can look where however it needs to look. Think about where your stakeholders are, again, as Jake was saying earlier. Do that inventory of where things are happening. But I love that it's a good, I think, for, I'll speak for myself, for too long I have thought my research methods and my tooling and my approach to analysis are so eye-opening that people are just going to get it. And certainly I'm a great talker, I'm going to talk it so good, but doesn't always resonate. People's time, they have noise cognitively, they've got childcare or
Yeah.
something outside of work or something within work that's bothering or just clouding them. And so I love that insight summary. One of your pieces of advice that I think is so great, and it'll lean into our next section, is write these titles with your stakeholders. I love that idea of inviting the people who you want to use the research into the shaping and creation of the nugget. Can you talk a bit about that? Why do you think it's important that someone who will be using the research, or your partners or stakeholders, be invited in on that process? Often researchers can be really guarded, like, no, I'm going to mold my insight clay. Why was that important for you to include?
I think yeah, the insight clay, certainly there's the research process and validity and all those things. That clay people don't want to open up, and understandably so. But there's the layers on top of it that are about communicating, and it's about finding that articulation. And in the book I talk about title standards. Even if you have all sorts of folks contributing their insights to a common space, suddenly they need, when they're parallel, it's just so much easier to sort through a bunch of insights. And then within those, whatever format your team decides, I leaned into Etienne Fang's Kaleidoscope article from Uber, sort of a Mad Lib format, but whatever format you decide. And then the question is, what's the articulation that inspires? also points to what's next. So imagine, let's do a quick thought experiment. You got a ton of insight summaries built up over time, and these are all really important things. And you've tagged them to owning teams, which is the most important metadata for getting stuff done with insights. And you filter down to a set of insight summaries, and you do a report of that that is really just the titles of those insight summaries. You know, to your point about the abstraction and the feeling that researchers get, I've showed up to a team and, most of those titles bounced off because where they were at in their process and they gave feedback on the titles and we changed them, they were executing. They weren't ready to think about this stuff. Planning cycle comes up, bring back the exact same list. So many of them have face validity to them, and it's not the first time they've seen them, that they don't want to dig into the details. It's kind of horrifying for a researcher, but if informing a decision and giving them a good planning problem to solve is the goal, of course, implementers can dig into the details, but the
Sure.
decision maker got what they needed. All of this, it adds a layer on top of research. Research, it's not about changing how researchers are working today. It's about tweaking some things and adding on layers that can then turn up their impact over time.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and you are in that example. You are there either physically or digitally, the face, the voice next to the name, next to the stack of decisions. Like, oh right, man, Jake and Ben on that research team. Gosh, they helped us avoid these misses. They helped us orient toward these hits. Let's give them more headcount, or
Yes.
let's keep them around. Again, there's this sort of clenching that researchers feel. That's how you can justify and advocate for your value.
Absolutely. And at the individual level, if folks use those insight summaries, your research is linked in there. All the researchers that contributed to those insight summaries on some topics, it can be several,
Hmm.
they all get a share of the credit.
Yeah.
And that's credit that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise. It's the impact that they wouldn't have had. So yes, like scaling these good things over time, both at the individual level, but also organizationally, how do we think about research and the value it provides, and how can we fund that?
I love that. And of course, I've done the thing that I said at the top I would not do. The AI summaries that are included, as helpful as they are in many of these tools, I get so many emails. They're like, Ben, you need to stop talking so much. Let your guess. I'm sure this one's going to be like, Ben, as a co-host, you're not really being a co. So I will encourage folks to check out the book again for the three frames. We just talked about preparation. We have motivation and integration. I'm wondering if we could actually skip motivation for a moment and linger on integration, because so much of what these three root causes are interrelated, they're integrated, and they speak to one another. Walk me through or unpack how a lack of integration or integration functions as waste. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about recurring interactions. I hear from so many researchers that they are struggling to get face time with their stakeholders, struggling to get that influence, that seat at the table, as it were. So, what is integration as it relates to waste, and how have you helped people push and engage with their stakeholders in a recurring way?
Such a great question. I mean, integration as a root cause is that folks don't have enough touch points, the right touch points with research. If we think about sort of normal research process and the conclusion of a study, that those moments where you're trying to connect, maybe some of your insights have impact in other teams potentially, which is as the organizations become increasingly fragmented, is a trend in the industry. That whole relational model that we talk about, being close with stakeholders gets harder and harder. So figuring out ways to integrate is a key point. But even with a stakeholder that you know well and you're trying to influence, the idea that sort of the end of a study is the touch points that will make that happen. It's really about seeing what other touch points can we have to bring back research. And if it's not a face-to-face meeting to tell that compelling story, what are the things that can help the intended audience build mind share for an insight over time, and eventually connect about it. It's the things that, when we talk about broadcasting research or sharing research, we're often talking about sort of, a common model I see in organizations is, study process and then some newsletters from different teams and things. But all those things fail to reach a level oftentimes where they motivate people to be more interested in research. Their leaders, that person's leader hasn't seen research. They haven't seen the impact that research had on their peers, so they don't know. So there's just a lot of ideas for turning up visibility, whether that's broadcasting all new insights because we that are coming into this sort of shared initiative, whether that's and we know that new research has this halo around it that draws interest, and that's an opportunity to tell stories about how research is being used and other things. Whether it's about filtering in insights and making sure they didn't want to meet about that, but here's a download of the most important unused or underutilized insights for this team, and it's going to be sent broadly. It's not. So there's a sense that sometimes research, it's one voice among many. If you start consolidating those voices together and you give it more visibility, suddenly there's more, you're a more collective stakeholder, and you have more, it's about elevating your role as a stakeholder if their leaders are interested in these things. And then it comes down to, there's a chapter in integration on citation. You never get to 100%, obviously. It's not the point, but it's an accidental side effect from that I've doubled down on in this book, where by giving everything its own URL, people find value in linking to it to justify their own efforts. And by justifying their own efforts and then doing great things, other people might see that and want to emulate it. And, everything from, some people hear citation and they sort of balk, but if you just think of it as it's not an academic thing, it's just you're linking to the research in the repositories that you're using to justify what you're doing. And I've seen those go straight to the top, CEO documents full of them. There's a chapter on that. And then the last chapter is about finding those moments, those points to bring research back. How can we push research into different kinds of decisions, and find those collaborations with design, find the right moments in owning teams, do some of the work of marking up their plans with insights, working in their spaces to make research visible. And then, at a leadership level, once you've had some successes at those other levels tied into business reporting, I've heard people working in enterprise resource planning cycles to motivate resourcing, all sorts of amazing things that can happen by kind of building a culture of being more specific about the research that's being used. People know it's valuable because it's very visible and because they've seen how it has impacted various streams of work. And a great insight is it speaks for itself.
Some listeners may hear, gosh, that sounds like a lot of work for me, the researcher. I know sometimes our community can feel that we're maybe underloved and that the work we have to do all the carrying of the water for the user, quote unquote. I think there is an extent to which our partners ought to meet us, and they will once they
Mm,
see that the product teams who are leveraging customer insights are going to have better products. They're going to have less churn. They're going to have more, they're going to have wider adoption. They'll like, if we've done our job, trust me, that those designs will be sharper. Our access will be speaking to different sorts of users. Like, that'll happen. And it is also up to us and on us a bit to know how product decisions are made, know how leadership interacts with product teams, all the things you've been talking about, Jake. It pays dividends. So what you've been talking about at the upfront, where you prepare, kind of do an inventory, here it is again. How can you check in with your stakeholders? Do they do a quick retro at the end of a sprint? You should be there. And if you don't know whether they do, find out if they do. I know that sometimes that can feel like, gosh, but I just delivered the project. Didn't
yes.
I do my job? But well, there's more. There's more there.
Yeah, and to speak to that individualistic road just for a moment is, again, this is about an initiative. This isn't one person doesn't do all this work. And what do initiatives have the benefit of that an individual research team doesn't? They can report more broadly to leadership. They can ask for project-based resources. If it's a planning cycle and you need to go back to all those teams, could there be someone from corporate ops or sometimes even finance? There's folks that are interested that can do some of this lifting. So this isn't about adding a long list of things to individual researchers' workload, doing the things that they find most valuable. But as I have this model from crawl, walk, run, marathon. And, certainly what we're talking about there is marathon, run and marathon, and you don't get there unless you have additional resources in the mix. And researchers can help set that vision and don't have to do all the work themselves. But it's more of an initiative mindset than this individualistic mindset.
I appreciate that call in, and I that is something I can sometimes fall prey to. Where I'm writing an article, and it's like, well, step one, get alignment with your stakeholders, and you're like, well, Ben, that's an entire program that requires 15 stakeholders. So I want to close with a few things. First, what is that crawl step? We've
Mm.
talked about a lot of different ways. Certainly, folks listening, take the strategies and fit them into your organization. But generally, Jake, I'm asking you to paint with a very broad brush. What is something that a research practitioner, a designer, a product manager, someone who engages with or collects human customer insights do next week to start thinking about and addressing research waste?
Yeah, next week you could be at these early stages about showing that there's value in existing research. So we talked about kind of taking a lens and having a look. Doesn't have to be super formal, just starting to talk about it. It's about on your next research project trying to be the model of collaboration that brings in additional data, that turns your report into a download on what's been learned, not just the latest sample. So starting that process, and starting to connect about how you can raise shared visibility together, instead of trying to just push upward on your own, starting to have conversations with folks. And there's a bunch of strategies in the book, but I think if I was to pick sort of early moves for next week, I would say those. I think the last one is, when you're planning your next study, extend the time frame, overlap your studies, and when you're activating one study, go back and activate some of the previous stuff as well. Check in on those things. Treat every activation phase from any study as an opportunity to talk to folks about past insights that maybe haven't landed yet.
Oh, I love that. I love that. It shows the value of research as a program. It it reminds the researcher of the holistic nature of their work. I love that. Pulling back, or sort of, you have your one hand on the one project, and what you've learned is a bad analogy. I don't know what this one hand is doing, but it's helping propel the other hand. I love that. I love that. Okay, so that's how we can start next week. How about someone who is new to the research space? You can answer this
Mm.
either by giving that person who's listening some advice, or advice that you would have given Jake, however many years ago it was. Let's say it was 5 years ago when you first started in the research UX world. What do you wish you knew then that you know now, and or what advice would you give to an early career person, whether they're transitioning into this career or they're maybe starting their career in user experience and customer insights generally?
Oh, it's a great question. It's over 20 years at this point. Got started in .com, but I think there's, especially these days, there's a intense pressure to meet current needs, to meet some of the current needs, push back on others, and take some time as an expert in your space to own your space, whether that's adding on research questions onto your studies that are much broader than anyone cares about at the moment, but they may care about later, or thinking of the systems that are going to help you do some of those things to extend your reach of your insights and get more value out of them. But I stepping trying to take some orders, but make some of your own orders as well, and don't always ask permission.
I love that. Love that. Okay, finally, because we're researchers researching research, so I want to ask a self-reflective question.
Mm.
How has the process, or how, yeah, writing this book changed you as a thinker, as a researcher, as an insights professional? You said at the top you don't often get the opportunity to really sit with a topic. I mean, I know there are some roles that are staff or principal researchers that can kind of live in that squishy zone of strategic research. How how was the practice of writing this book affect you as a researcher? How do you think your practice will change going forward, having gone through this?
I think I will always place more emphasis on building cross silo community as foundation. I think I've worked as an individual, plowing my own path, that heads down thing that we all enjoy, as it's sort of a personality characteristic of a lot of
Sure.
researchers. But building the bridges that can lead to standards, that can then lead to actual collaboration and shared information that can lead to shared impact. I think that there's sort of a mindset there that has been growing over time for me, but the articulation of it in this book has made it seem like some of the most important parts of the work.
The book is Stop Wasting Research, Maximize the Product Impact of Your Organization's Customer Insights. Jake, thank you so very much for some time. Check out the book. We'll be sending some promo codes to listeners so you can learn more about the book, Jake's work, as well as integrating research in the show notes. Thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the conversation.